Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a massive, but often completely invisible global economic engine. We're talking about the ancient Islamic tradition of Eid al-Adha and the incredibly complex, decentralized financial network it sparks into motion every single year. Seriously, it's not just a story about faith. It's a fascinating deep dive into microeconomics, global supply chains, and how people adapt to tough times.
To really give you a sense of the sheer scale we're dealing with here, official market estimates suggest this single event adds roughly 500 billion rupees to Pakistan's GDP alone. 500 billion. That is a massive injection of capital happening over a remarkably short window of just a few weeks. And in the process, it creates around 1.5 million temporary jobs, giving this huge, much-needed boost to rural farmers, transporters, and seasonal workers. It's an absolute economic phenomenon.
So let's start with Section 1, the massive Qurbani economy.
It's truly fascinating how a deeply personal religious act scales up to become this enormous economic and humanitarian force. At the very center of this economy is Qurbani. As you probably know, this is the annual tradition where Muslims commemorate Prophet Abraham's devotion by sacrificing livestock, usually sheep, goats, cows, or camels. But the absolute crucial part of this tradition is the redistribution. The meat isn't just kept by the family, it's strictly divided and shared, specifically targeting vulnerable people who need it the most.
Just to put that into perspective, last year, the charity Islamic Relief Worldwide alone distributed Qurbani meat to 3.2 million people across 29 different countries. I mean, just think about the logistics involved in pulling that off. For many of these families, this is literally the only meat they're going to eat all month. So it's an incredible decentralized mechanism for feeding people, but at the exact same time, it generates billions of dollars in livestock trade, sustaining this vast network of farmers, transporters, and local traders all over the globe.
Moving right along to Section 2, meet the roadside traders.
When we zoom in to the micro level to see how this actually builds out on the ground, it gets really interesting. Let's look at the microeconomy of Yogyakarta, Indonesia, where this festival practically transforms the streets themselves. During this season, temporary roadside livestock stalls pop up everywhere. And researchers studying these markets found some pretty distinct behavioral differences based on where the stall is located. Urban traders, right in the city center, tend to stay open for much longer hours, they often operate on rented land, and consequently they sell their livestock at slightly higher prices. Meanwhile, the peri-urban traders, the ones operating on the outskirts of town, tend to run individual stalls, hire just a few temporary employees, and offer slightly lower prices. The wild part is that most of these sellers are entirely opportunistic. They aren't selling livestock year-round. They just jump into the market specifically for the Eid season to capture that profit.
And they operate on a highly specific, almost predictable timeline. The entire life cycle of these pop-up stalls is exactly 22 days. They buy their livestock and pitch their tents about 22 days before Eid. For a couple of weeks, it's pretty quiet. People are just browsing. Then, 5 days before the festival, the rush hits. Buyers absolutely flood the stalls. By 3 days before Eid, prices hit their absolute maximum, sometimes jumping up by 35% as demand peaks. But just 3 days after the festival, the market completely crashes. Prices sharply drop as traders look to quickly liquidate whatever stock is left before they pack up and go back to their regular day jobs.
Which brings us to Section 3, digital cattle markets.
So, the crucial takeaway here is that while this is a deeply traditional market, it's far from static. Actually, it's rapidly modernizing. For decades, buying a cow or a goat meant walking into a crowded, dusty market, carrying literal bags of cash. It was high risk, heavily prone to theft, and entirely disorganized. But the new way is totally transforming that dynamic. This year, we've seen a massive shift toward mobile wallets, banking apps, and QR codes being scanned right there in the dirt lots. People are even paying for colorful animal ornaments and booking their local butchers well in advance using instant digital transfers. It's essentially bringing rural farming communities, many of whom have never used traditional banks, directly into the formal financial system.
The speed of this digital adoption is absolutely staggering. Listen to this. In just 15 days, over 1 billion rupees in online transactions were processed in the Punjab cattle markets alone. 1 billion. The government and major banks actually set up dedicated stalls right next to the livestock pens to facilitate this shift. They brought in mobile ATMs and agents to help buyers and sellers download apps on the spot. It dramatically reduces theft, saves a ton of time haggling, and builds a whole new layer of trust between urban buyers and rural sellers. Let's move to Section 4. How inflation changes sacrifice.
Technology isn't the only modern force shaping this ancient tradition. When we look at macroeconomics, specifically inflation, we can see it fundamentally altering cultural buying habits. Take Pakistan, for example. The economic backdrop there has been incredibly tough recently. Inflation has bounced back into the double digits. Fuel prices are up nearly 60% over the last year alone. That means the cost of transporting the animals from rural farms to urban centers, plus the cost of the fodder needed to feed them, has completely skyrocketed. At the exact same time, middle-class incomes are being squeezed tight. So how do consumers react to this immense pressure? Well, they shift their behavior. Instead of individual households buying their own goat or sheep, families and neighborhoods are increasingly pooling their money together for collective sacrifices.
Because people are pooling their money, the projected slaughter of large animals, like cows and bulls, is actually up by 12%, hitting about 2.8 million animals. Conversely, the demand for smaller animals like goats and sheep is down by 4%. People simply can't afford a 60,000 rupee price tag for a single goat for just one family anymore, so the smaller animal market is shrinking in favor of shared shares in larger cattle.
And that creates a fascinating domino effect, which we'll cover in Section 5, the leather industry ripple.
Now, you might think a 4% drop in goat sales is just a minor domestic statistic, but in a highly connected global economy, it triggers a massive ripple effect that impacts global trade. Here is exactly how those dominoes fall. Step 1. Consumers shift to collective cow sacrifice to escape domestic inflation. Step 2. Because fewer small animals are sacrificed, the local tanning industry experiences a sudden 5% shortage in high-quality goat and sheep skins, which happens to be the exact type of skins they rely on for their premium exports. Step 3. To keep their factories running and fulfill international orders, Pakistani leather manufacturers are forced to look overseas, significantly increasing their imports of raw skins from places like New Zealand, Australia, and the UK.
But even with that localized shortage, the tanning industry still expects to collect around $36 million worth of hides over the Eid holiday alone. This raw material is absolutely vital. It's used by Pakistan to produce premium waterproof, fireproof, and military-grade leather gloves and garments that it exports to international markets. Normally, this burst of local hide collection substitutes about $150 million in raw material imports. It really just goes to show how deeply reliant global manufacturing and international supply chains are on this highly localized religious festival.
Finally, let's take a look at Section 6, Charity in a Fragile World. Zooming back out to the global stage, we see that while the Eid economy fuels domestic industries, it's also carrying an increasingly heavy burden when it comes to international humanitarian relief. According to organizations like Islamic Relief, delivering aid right now is more challenging than ever. We're seeing major disruptions in Middle East supply chains, heavily inflating transport costs worldwide. In Sudan, local inflation pushed the cost of providing a single Qurbani meal from $5 to $8 in just a matter of months. In Somalia, fuel has literally tripled in price. And all of this is happening while formal governments around the world are slashing their humanitarian funding budgets by up to 45%. The formal institutional aid system is shrinking precisely when global hunger is rising.
Which brings us to a really powerful thought from the CEO of Islamic Relief Worldwide. He notes that this tradition is a, quote, powerful decentralized mechanism of global redistribution. In a world where there's enough food for everyone, yet hundreds of millions of people go without. When formal government aid pulls back, these faith-based, decentralized traditions of giving, whether it's Qurbani in Islam, tithing in Christianity, or Dana in Buddhism, they step right in to fill those massive gaps. It proves that this isn't just an economic event. It's a vital, highly scalable tool for combating global food insecurity at a true grassroots level.
We've seen how a single tradition can inject billions into a local GDP, force global leather imports, digitize rural cattle markets, and feed millions across 29 countries. It really makes you wonder, how might other ancient traditions hold hidden economic and humanitarian solutions for the very modern crises we face today? Think about that for a bit. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time as we continue to break down the fascinating systems that run our world.